Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams. Today's episode is for two people at once. And if you are a trainer or instructor, I want you to stay right here with me through this whole conversation because the second half of what I am going to share is going to reframe something fundamental about what happens in your warm up ring on show day. And if you are an amateur rider, the first half is going to change how you understand what your nervous system is actually doing when the stakes feel real. Let me set a scene. Two riders warm up side by side before the same class at the same show. Both of them are nervous. Both have elevated heart rates. Both are acutely aware of the judge, the audience, the weight of everything they have put into getting here. One of them is thinking, my body is ready for this. The other is thinking, something is wrong with me. Same physiology, completely different trajectories from that moment forward. Not because of talent, not because of preparation level, not because one of them has more experience with this particular venue. Different trajectories because of the appraisal, the rapid, largely automatic calculation the brain runs in the background that asks, what does this situation demand of me? And do I have enough to meet it? Because that question and the answer the brain generates to it determines what kind of body you are riding with for the rest of that class. This is what researchers call the challenge threat model, and it is one of the most practically important frameworks in performance psychology and one of the least discussed in equestrian sport. Here is the essential distinction. Both challenge and threat states begin with the same thing: activation. Your heart rate goes up, your nervous system is engaged, your body is mobilizing resources because the situation matters to you. That initial activation is not the problem, and it is not the difference. The divergence happens in what follows, and it happens fast. When your brain appraises the situation and concludes that your resources, your skills, your preparation, your experience, your sense of control are roughly sufficient to meet what is being demanded, the body moves into what researchers call a challenge state. In this configuration, cardiac output increases substantially, blood vessels dilate rather than constrict, and the dominant hormonal profile is adrenaline driven, fast, efficient mobilization with relatively rapid recovery. The cardiovascular system is in a high efficiency configuration. Blood is being delivered to where it is needed. The body is oriented toward approach and action. When the brain appraises the same situation and concludes that the demands exceed the available resources, the body moves into a threat state. And this is where the physiology genuinely diverges. Cardiac output rises less efficiently. Blood vessels constrict rather than dilate. The stress hormone cortisol enters the picture alongside adrenaline. And cortisol, unlike adrenaline, produces a more sustained, more prolonged defensive response with all the downstream effects on prefrontal function, attentional flexibility, and working memory that previous episodes have covered in detail. The body is aroused but not efficiently mobilized, activated but not optimally resourced. The heart rate might be identical to the challenge state rider warming up beside you. The physiology underneath that number is doing something meaningfully different. Research across sport, surgery simulation, academic testing, and public performance has consistently shown that the challenge cardiovascular profile produces better performance outcomes than the threat profile for the same level of overall arousal. Not dramatically different outcomes, but reliably different ones, and reliably enough that the appraisal process is worth understanding and worth working with deliberately. Now, what actually drives the appraisal toward challenge or toward threat? On the demand side, the things that push the evaluation toward threat are task difficulty, uncertainty about outcomes, social evaluation pressure, and novelty. A competition environment provides nearly all of these simultaneously. The judge's presence is evaluative. The test or course represents a specific challenge. The outcome matters financially, emotionally, and in terms of identity. The required effort is real. If you are an amateur who has driven 2 hours, paid entry fees, and loaded your horse before dawn, the investment itself adds weight to the demand side of the equation before the warm up has even begun. On the resources side, the things that push the evaluation toward challenge are skill and competence, prior successful experience with similar challenges, social support, perceived control, and clarity about what is actually being asked. And this is where the amateur's structural situation becomes worth examining honestly, because several of the most powerful resource factors are systematically influenced by the amateur's circumstances in ways that tend to deplete the resource side before the appraisal process even begins. The rider who arrives at a show having survived a difficult work week rather than managed it has less regulatory reserve. The rider who walks into the warm up ring sees horses and riders with more experience and immediately activates the thought, I am just an amateur, has already shifted the resource side of the equation downward before her horse has taken a single step. The rider who competes rarely because time and money and logistics make frequent competition genuinely difficult carries more novelty into each event, and novelty increases perceived demands. These are not imagined disadvantages. They are real structural factors that shape the demand resource calculation in specific traceable ways. What the research also shows is that the appraisal is not fixed. It shifts dynamically, trial by trial, day by day, and even within a single warm up session. A warm up that goes well shifts the appraisal even if the test itself is unchanged. Prior experience with this level of competition reduces novelty and uncertainty. And critically, the deliberate reinterpretation of physiological arousal can shift the appraisal directly, in the moment, with measurable cardiovascular consequences. This is where the research becomes genuinely actionable and where I want to be precise rather than general, because this is not about positive thinking, and it is not about telling yourself you feel fine when you do not. The intervention researchers call arousal reappraisal works like this. Rather than attempting to reduce the physiological activation before performance, which is both neurobiologically difficult and, interestingly, counterproductive, you change what that activation means. You redirect the interpretation from threat signal to preparation signal. The racing heart is your body mobilizing for something that matters. The tight stomach is your digestive system diverting resources to where they are needed. The electric alertness is your perceptual system sharpening for the task ahead. None of this is self deception. It is a reinterpretation that is, physiologically speaking, more accurate than the threat interpretation. Because the body's activation before a challenging event genuinely is preparation, not malfunction. Research comparing two simple instructions before a performance, one group told to try to calm down and another group told to interpret their arousal as excitement, shows consistently that the reappraisal instruction produces better performance because attempting to suppress arousal is not only difficult, but sends a secondary signal to the threat appraisal system. This activation is dangerous enough to require suppression. That secondary signal deepens the threat state rather than resolving it. The deliberate reinterpretation of arousal as preparation does the opposite. It increases the perceived resource side of the demand resource calculation, and that shift produces a measurably more efficient cardiovascular profile even when the arousal level itself remains identical or increases. Research across exam settings, e-sport competitions, surgical simulations, and motor performance tasks shows small but reliable performance improvements from this intervention. The effect is not enormous, but it is consistent, and it compounds with other interventions. Reappraisal combined with genuine self-efficacy development, with a history of challenge-appraised competitive experiences, and with managed pre-competition stress load produces larger effects than any single element alone. For amateur riders specifically, this means several things worth naming directly. The habit of reappraisal is itself a skill, and like any skill, it benefits from practice in conditions that approximate the real thing. The rider who practices interpreting activation as preparation during difficult schooling sessions, when she is working on something genuinely challenging, when the nervous system is somewhat engaged but not at competition levels, is building a neural pathway for that reframe. She is making it more accessible when the stakes are highest, rather than assembling it for the first time at the gate of a competition she has been anxious about for 2 weeks. Building a history of challenge, appraised competitive experiences matters enormously and is something that cannot be shortcut. Every competition at which a rider genuinely experiences herself as adequate to the demands, where the outcome of the demand resource calculation tips toward sufficient rather than overwhelmed, adds to a resource bank the brain draws on automatically the next time an evaluative situation arrives. Research shows that repeated threat appraised experiences build a prior expectation of threat that makes future challenge appraisal progressively less accessible. The cycle runs in the positive direction too. Repeated challenge appraised experiences build a prior expectation of sufficiency that makes challenge appraisal progressively more available. This is the specific mechanism behind the value of competing regularly at levels that are genuinely within reach, not because it lowers the standard, but because it builds the experiential foundation that makes the challenge appraisal credible rather than aspirational. Now, I want to turn directly to trainers and instructors because what the challenge threat research reveals about the warm up ring on show day is something that I think most coaches are not fully using. The resource side of a rider's appraisal equation is actively sensitive in those minutes before she enters the ring. The appraisal is still forming, it is not fixed, and the research on what shifts perceived resources identifies social support and perceived control as two of the most powerful factors, both of which a trainer is uniquely positioned to influence in either direction. A trainer who arrives at the warm up ring and begins loading more technical instruction onto a nervous system already running hot is not, in that moment, helping the rider perform better. She may be technically improving specific components of what she is observing. But at the level of the appraisal, the rapid demand resource calculation that is simultaneously happening in the rider's nervous system, each new correction adds to the perceived demands rather than the perceived resources. The rider's sense of control and competence in that moment is not increased by being told more things to fix. It is decreased because the implicit message is, there is more wrong than you can manage right now. This is not an argument for withholding coaching. It is an argument for understanding the timing and framing of what is offered. In the warm up ring on show day, what shifts the resource side of the equation is the trainer communicating specifically and credibly what the rider actually has prepared for, not generic encouragement. Riders see through generic encouragement, and it tends to increase perceived demands by signaling that something requires encouragement. Specific, calm acknowledgement of what the horse and rider have genuinely built together. You have ridden this movement well 100 times. Your half halt is solid. Your eye to this fence is accurate. That specificity is not kindness at the expense of coaching. It is a direct intervention in the appraisal process at the exact moment the appraisal is most malleable. The framing trainers use around arousal in ordinary training lessons also shapes the belief structures a rider brings to competition, accumulated slowly over months and years. A rider who has been consistently told, implicitly or explicitly, that pre-performance nerves mean something is wrong, that activation is a problem requiring management, arrives at a show with a threat interpretation of her own physiology already built in. A rider whose trainer has consistently normalized activation as preparation, as the body doing something appropriate and functional, arrives with a different prior. These beliefs are not formed in a single conversation. They are built through hundreds of ordinary lessons, through the language used around difficult moments, through whether mistakes are treated as information or as alarm. The trainer's daily framing of difficulty and arousal is, in a real sense, building the appraisal structure that the rider will use at a show she is not attending with her trainer. Research on what is called stress mindset, the general belief that stress can be enhancing and functional rather than inherently harmful, shows lasting changes in cortisol response, daily well being, and performance outcomes when this belief is genuinely internalized rather than superficially applied. The good news is that this belief is built through experience, not just through instruction, and the experience is built in ordinary training sessions where difficulty is met, survived, and processed as information rather than evidence of inadequacy. There is a transformation available to every rider who stands at the gate with a pounding heart and a tight chest and the particular kind of electric alertness that shows up when something genuinely matters. The transformation is not making those sensations go away. It is changing what they mean to the brain, to the cardiovascular system, to the performance that follows. The same nerves that produce one rider's anxiety produce another rider's readiness. What differs is the appraisal, and the appraisal, within limits that are real and achievable, is within reach, built through the history you create, the framing you practice, and the deliberate choice made at the gate to interpret activation as preparation rather than as evidence that something is wrong with you. That choice does not come from nowhere. It comes from building the conditions that make it credible, competing at levels where your nervous system learns what sufficiency actually feels like, managing the cumulative stress load that depletes the resource side before competition begins, practicing the reappraisal language until it is accessible under pressure, and surrounding yourself with people who communicate confidence in what you have genuinely prepared. For trainers, it comes from understanding that what you say and how you say it in the warm up ring is not peripheral to performance preparation. It is, at the level of the nervous system, the preparation. Everything I have covered today is drawn from the research in my new book, The Amateur's Edge: The Psychology of the Amateur Equestrian Brain, available now on Amazon. The link is in the show notes. If you are a trainer who works with adult amateur riders, or an amateur trying to understand why your competition experiences keep diverging so dramatically from your training, this book was written for exactly that gap. The mechanisms are real, the research is specific, and the path from anxiety to usable energy is more documented and more navigable than most riders are ever told. You do not need the heart rate to drop. You need what the heart rate means to change, and that is something you can actually work with. I am Esther Adams. This is Strides to Solutions.